So welcome everyone to the first public forum of the UMBC Center for Ethics and Values of 2025-2026. And we are delighted to have you all here for our discussion of energy wars at home and abroad. I am Jessica Pfeiffer, Director of the Center and Chair of the Philosophy Department where the center is housed. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that UMBC was established upon the land of the Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples. Over time, citizens of many more indigenous nations have come to reside in this region. We humbly offer our respects to all present, past, and future indigenous people connected to this place. And while we recognize the importance of acknowledging those who came before us, we also know that this is a small gesture, and we must also take action toward the necessary work of repair. The mission of the Center for Ethics and Values is to foster thoughtful, informed, and nuanced exploration of pressing ethical issues we face. Ethical issues are everywhere. We face ethical decisions in nearly everything we do, in our work, in our research, as students, as teachers, in our families, in our friendships, in deciding what to eat, in deciding whether to go to a public forum, in deciding what car to drive to the public forum, or how to power our homes, or in deciding where we get our news, or what shows to watch, or what social media to use, in deciding how to vote, and so on. These public forums provide an opportunity for us to come together as a community, including not only the community within UMBC, but also the wider community that UMBC serves, to work together to gain a deeper understanding of these serious ethical issues. This event today was organized in coordination with the Human Context of Science and Technology program and the Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law program. Both of these programs are undergraduate certificate programs that combine the perspectives of multiple disciplines to address our deepest social issues. The Human Context of Science and Technology program combines the humanities and social sciences to gain a deeper understanding of the critical issues related to science and technology. And the Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law program combines the perspectives of those fields to help address complex social problems. The latter is a new program that will begin enrolling students this coming spring. For those students who are interested in finding out more, there are flyers on the table in the entryway. This event also would not have been possible without our co-sponsors. Many thanks to the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems and to the School of Public Policy for generously supporting this event. And a special thanks to Vanessa Capuano, without whom this event and everything else we do would not be possible. We hope you will join us for our future public forums this year. On Thursday, December 4th at 7 p.m., once again in this location, and also live streamed on UMBC's YouTube channel, we will have a discussion of the ethics of cryptocurrency, co-organized with the Drescher Center for the Humanities. On Monday, February 23, also at 7 p.m. in this location, we will have our Evelyn Barker Memorial Lecture, which is also part of the Drescher Center's Humanities Forum, featuring Hannah Pickard, who will be talking about her new book, What Would You Do Alone in a Cage with Nothing But Cocaine? A Philosophy of Addiction. And on Monday, April 13, this time at 4 p.m., so a little earlier in the day, in this location, we'll be holding an eminent scholar lecture featuring Stephen Engel discussing progressive Confucianism, and I hope I don't butcher this, nay, why citizenship and the family. I'm looking to my colleague who would know the correct pronunciation. For more information about these public forums, please visit us at ethics.umbc.edu. Follow us on social media and sign up to receive our newsletter. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Andrew Light and our moderator, Professor Blake Francis. Professor Light is a distinguished professor of philosophy, of public policy, philosophy, and atmospheric sciences at George Mason University, and distinguished fellow at the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth at the University of Chicago. In addition to being a distinguished philosopher who has written over 100 articles and co-authored, authored, or edited 19 books, Dr. Light has held a variety of positions in government and non-governmental organizations working on clean energy and climate issues. From 2021 to 2025, he served as United States Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs in the Biden administration, focusing on accelerating a global clean energy transition while ensuring energy security. From 2013 to 2016, he served as senior advisor and India counselor to the U.S. Special Envoy on Climate Change, as well as a staff member for climate in the Secretary of State's Office of Policy Planning, working on the Paris Agreement and other platforms for climate cooperation. He has also been a distinguished senior fellow at the World Resources Institute and senior fellow and director of international climate and energy policy at the Center for American Progress. Dr. Light has exemplified throughout his career exactly what we are trying to do with the Center for Ethics and Values, which bring professional training in ethics and philosophy to bear on some of our deepest problems. It is no surprise that the International Society for Environmental Ethics has created the Andrew Light Award for Public Philosophy in honor of Andrew's tireless commitment to bringing philosophy to the public sphere through his work both within and outside government on climate and environmental policy. We are delighted to have him join us tonight for our first public forum of this year. Today's discussion will be moderated by Professor Blake Francis, whose research also focuses on moral responsibility and climate change. Dr. Francis is assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and director of the Human Context of Science and Technology program I mentioned earlier. And now for the logistics. We will begin with an informal discussion between Dr. Francis and Dr. Light, and then we will open the discussion to all of you. When you arrived, you should have been handed a piece of paper with a QR code, which you can use to submit questions. And you can submit questions whenever you'd like. Now, although probably it makes more sense to actually hear something first, but you're welcome to submit questions at any point. You also received a survey, and we would greatly appreciate your taking just a few minutes to fill that out. Your feedback will help support and improve our efforts to provide public-facing discussions about important issues related to ethics and values. And there will be a basket when you leave to drop the form in. And now I will turn it over to you, Blake. So thanks.
All right. Thank you. Am I audible? Can you all hear me? Okay. All right. Excellent. So thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk to us today about your experiences, and I'm going to focus my questions mostly on your experiences with the Biden administration, and then also see if you can talk to us a little bit about what's going on in climate and energy with the new administration, which at some point I guess we have to stop calling it a new administration, but the current administration. So. You were nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2021 to serve as the Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs. And I think for a lot of us, it's not clear what that position is, what the purpose of the position is. And I wonder if you can describe your expectations, maybe your initial expectations of this nomination, and also sort of what your duties and responsibilities were in that service position.
Thanks, Blake. It's really great to be here with you. Thank you very much to the center and the department and all the other programs for supporting my trip up here, which is nice to not have to get on a plane and go to an event like this. So it was great to just slowly get up the Beltway and in under an hour still, so it's fine. And so it's great to be here on campus. So the Department of Energy was formed in the Carter administration. So as departments go, I mean, there are some that are younger, like the Department of Homeland Security and such, but it's certainly not one of the original, parts of the executive branch of the federal government, like you think of the Department of State or the Department of Defense, now once again the Department of War, and so on and so on, the Department of Treasury, for example. So Department of Energy is pretty new, and when Congress created it with the support of the president, it was building in kind of legacy things that have been along for quite some time. So most prominently, if you think about sort of the legacy of the Manhattan Project in World War II to build the world's first atomic bomb. So those facilities that were put together then, think of like Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and then what became Sandia National Labs, Los Alamos, obviously, Oak Ridge in Tennessee. Those were all energy facilities that were run by the federal government continuously from the time of the creation, right, of that project. And that then obviously, and think about what was happening when in the 70s, when we were creating a Department of Energy, then obviously we realized that there's a important federal government role in something that is still very much regulated also by the states, if you think about like who you buy your power from and power market authorities and things like that. But what was the big thing that happened in the 1970s? The big oil shock, right? When gas prices skyrocketed. I was a little kid then, but I distinctly remember, my parents talking about this and the concerns about this and, the sort of the covers of Time and Newsweek magazine about the long lines and sort of things like this, where the economy was really grinding to a halt because we have, and still had then, still have today, the oil market is a global market. It really kind of doesn't matter what resources that you have as a country with respect to bringing something, a fossil fuel like oil, out of your own territory. It's a global market now. All the oil goes into a big pool, and you had a collection of specific countries that were able to basically exert pressure on that market because of other geopolitical concerns, and then tie up a country like the United States. And around the same time, actually, and this was one of my duties, it turned out, when I had this last position in the Biden-Harris administration, about 50 years ago, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State under President Nixon, created something called the International Energy Agency, which is part of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development headquartered in Paris. And so it was actually put together so that non-OPEC countries could create a system of oil reserves that they would then agree to keep a certain amount of oil in the United States, we would keep it in salt caverns in Louisiana and Texas, and then when needed, because of supply problems like the one they encountered in the 70s, do collective actions, collective releases, something I'll come back to on that later. So these energy institutions were, for a new globalized world, were sort of happening and sort of being created then, and that becomes the nuclear parts of that legacy, and then these different parts of other parts of the Department of Energy came together to become a kind of all-encompassing energy part of the U.S. energy infrastructure. What's the other thing that Carter famously did? I don't know if people remember this. He put something on the White House. It wasn't a new ballroom. Anyone know what Carter put on the White House that then was dismantled by President Reagan? What? Solar panels, yes. Carter put solar panels on the White House. So we were trying to look for a new form of energy independence, which was not reliant on fossil energy. Solar was ridiculously expensive at the time, but now it's super cheap, the cheapest source of power in the world. And so we built the kind of the institution of the Department of Energy. When Congress created this, they sort of chunked out the department in different parts. So there was the Bureau of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy to do with these new resources, a Bureau of Fossil Energy to deal, obviously, with the fossil energies, which were then the primary driver of the global economy, a Bureau of Nuclear Energy, and then an Office of International Affairs. It was then actually Office of International Affairs and Policy. and stipulated there should be an Assistant Secretary of Energy for International Affairs. And there has been one ever since, and I was the last one. The Trump administration has not yet been able to nominate and confirm someone to replace me, so there's someone acting in that role now. So the job is basically this. You sort of are one of the 2-3 people in the federal government who is primarily responsible for all U.S. bilateral, meaning between the U.S. and one other party, or multilateral collections of other countries under something like the group of G7 nations or the G20 nations, or a bunch of other international platforms, doing energy cooperation. And in our administration, it was primarily to start, we should talk about it changed radically about a year in, but it started out being one where the first Trump administration pulled back from a lot of international energy cooperation, not nearly like what they're doing now, which is a whole different kind of way of doing diplomacy, which I'm happy to talk about. But they pulled back from where the US had been in a leadership role through the Obama administration, for the most part, on trying to get a clean energy transition, largely to respond to climate change, but also to create lots of good-paying jobs in the process, and then all the ancillary other environmental benefits you get from clean energy as opposed to unabated fossil energy. And so when they asked me to take this job, I was like, great, absolutely. You know, I'm not going to, you sort of go where they send you. It was no guarantee just because I was in the Obama administration. I'd be asked to be in the Biden administration. So I said, absolutely, I'm happy to do that job. It's something I feel that I can make a contribution to. And I had a team of about 130 people, all told, and 2 of the best bosses I could ever imagine. I hope that all of you get a chance to work for bosses as terrific as the ones that I worked for. Jennifer Granholm, who was our Secretary of Energy, a former 2-term governor of Michigan, and also 2-term Attorney General of Michigan, obviously knew a ton about energy and transportation from being governor of Michigan, and was governor when Detroit was being bailed out, right, essentially, during the 2008-2009 financial collapse. Part of that was hitting Detroit really badly. Detroit was bailed out and agreed to transition to EVs and things like that, so that was really her biggest contributions on energy before that job. And then the Deputy Secretary of Energy was a guy named Dave Turk, who I'd worked with, was on the same team as me at the State Department as one of the climate negotiators working on the Paris Agreement, a bunch of other things. So that's kind of what you're doing. The job was it was global. I mean, essentially we created or expanded or tailored a bit 35, 40 bilateral significant cooperation schemes with all the biggest developed and developing countries around the world, and then we're involved in all kinds of multilateral negotiations to try to just get the world moving towards energy, because if you cannot solve the climate problem without transforming the energy system. It just is that important a part of that role, and that was what the job entailed.
Awesome. So there's so many questions that I could ask about that description of your job, but I want to ask about the big change that happened months into you accepting this position, and that is Russia's attack on Ukraine. And of course, this is a conflict that's still ongoing. And one of Russia's strategies was to weaponize energy in a couple of different ways. One was manipulating fossil fuel supply to countries that support Ukraine, and the other was sort of a direct destruction through bombing of the Ukrainian energy grid. Can you sort of, maybe starting with the change in your job description, talk about the U.S.'s response to Russia's weaponization of energy and what your role was in the U.S.'s response?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. And you know, this is where the job changed. So when I think it was, I can't remember exactly, 2-3 weeks after the election, I was asked to interview for the job that I eventually got. And I thought, okay, all right, I thought maybe They would sort of see if I wanted to go back to the State Department or the National Security Council and do something that was sort of more centrally on the climate negotiation side. Again, but so I'd worked with the Department of Energy, in fact, the office that I wound up running, but I'd never thought, okay, they'll send me to the Department of Energy. I'm so glad they did, and I enjoyed the job immensely. And I did feel like I had the background and what I needed to jump in on day one. And I'm kind of one of, I think it's 14 of us who served, so sort of a dubious distinction, served from minute one of the Biden administration to minute last of the Biden administration. So I was in there for the entire thing, and really just began on day one, like doing the job, getting the U.S. back into a leadership position on a global clean energy transition. And then I had all these counterparts throughout the building, of course, who were then planning for the huge transformation of the U.S. energy system through the bipartisan infrastructure legislation first and then the Inflation Reduction Act, which have been dismantled, though not completely. It's kind of interesting. We should talk a little bit about that. So that was the job I was asked to do and the job I thought I was prepared to do. And I had lots of ideas about what were the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th, 15th thing we needed to do. What I had no experience was essentially fighting an energy war, which is effectively what we had to do starting in February 2022. So a couple things you need to keep in mind about conditions were there. Russia had used energy as a weapon the first time it invaded Ukraine, when they invaded Crimea. In fact, the first thing that was done, and this was still true when I started in office, it was still true up until a few days before the war started. In the fall of 2022, the Ukrainian grid was actually connected to the Russian grid. And so the Russians began the invasion in Crimea, years and years before, as a cyber attack on the Ukrainian electricity grid to get it to go down. And we knew from that experience that there was still a possibility that might happen again. So we knew there was going to be something like that as the intelligence began to manifest itself through the fall of 2021, that there was probably going to be an invasion. And make no mistake, I mean, it's all been publicly reported. I'm not telling you anything, that I shouldn't I was in meetings, 1, 2, 3 meetings a week at the White House for the rest of my time in office after the war started, just dealing with the Ukraine, the energy parts of the Ukraine war. The Russians were diabolical at their planning for this. So that's one, they'd already weaponized energy. Good part about that is that we have actually 17 national laboratories now in the Department of Energy. So it's not just the nuclear Manhattan project legacy labs, but now you've got the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado. You've got the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in Washington State, and on and on and on. There's all these, Brookhaven National Lab in Long Island. And the great thing, the Trump administration Trump 1 had taken very seriously those attacks that Russia had done before. And so there was a team of some 30, 40 engineers who had actually really worked hard on Ukraine and already built incredibly good dynamic models. So I was like, as soon as this happens, I'm just told, all right, you got to jump into these meetings right now, and we got to sort of look at the energy impacts. And I did not have the requisite background to that, but the good part was that I had a whole team, access to a whole team of incredibly good diplomats and policy analysts and engineers especially, who did understand it. The other thing that's important to remember is that Russia was the biggest oil exporter in the world at the time that they invaded Ukraine. And the third important thing to realize is that the people that we were fighting the war, aiding the Ukrainians closest with, right, on the military side, was of course the Europeans, mostly members of the European Union. And the Europeans at that point were incredibly reliant on cheap piped natural gas from Russia, massive quantities of it. If you look at, we've seen this, people talk about gas as a transition fuel. And to be sure, when the U.S. went through the revolution in what's called the so-called shale gas revolution from using fracking technology originally developed by the Department of Energy and then kind of given to the industry so that the US suddenly was like this massive supplier of natural gas, we were able to shift away from a lot of our coal and our emissions dropped. European emissions also dropped because they got access to cheap Russian pipe gas coming through pipelines from Russia, and they were switching out of their coal, mostly using this incredibly cheap, lower carbon, but nonetheless a fossil fuel natural gas. The Europeans, to get through times of concern about disruptions in supply, but also when they had to use a lot more because of cold winters, climatic effects, they have big underground storages of natural gas. And this is the third most important thing to remember. Those storage of natural gas were at critically low levels, historically low levels. They had very little gas in reserve. So three things happen right away. First of all, what happens is we see disruptions happening in the supply of oil around the world, some of which we could pin on particular actors, some of which we couldn't, but we had our suspicions from what it was coming to. And what's worse, oil traders are getting incredibly nervous, right? And so you're starting to see fluctuations in oil prices that are pretty dangerous, and what eventually happens is gas prices go up. Now, the US is producing a ton of oil at this point. This is not the 1970s. We're now a net oil exporter. But again, it's a global market. So our oil produced by Chevron and Mobil and all those people doesn't just go to American consumers. It goes into a global market, and the global market has a global price, right? And so there's nothing short of nationalizing the oil industry and making or doing something close, like saying American oil companies can't export, which no government has ever done, where you could actually change that dynamic, and that's not been done, and no government has tried to yet. Has been done in other countries. So we start seeing disturbances in the oil markets. Traders get panicked, and we need, and you know, the thing that we're a democracy, and we needed a strong administration to make this big commitment to help Ukraine, which everybody thought the Russians were going to just blow through in 2 weeks a month, easily. But then we see that they have this amazing capacity to be innovative and form this incredible partnership with us and like other allies to fight back the Russians. But we're worried that gas prices are going to go up and Americans would lose support, right, for this war that otherwise is happening far away. And so this is where we use the International Energy Agency system, 50 years later, right, essentially, and did two massive collective releases. The first one was 60 million barrels in April 1st, 2022, and the second one was 120 million barrels. So 180 million barrels in total. Released that with about 30 other countries onto the market so the market's stabilized. And I've been a climate negotiator, not an oil release negotiator, right? So suddenly, like I'm thinking, it's going to look good on my resume when I go back to climate work. But anyway, so that's part one. But we had to do that. That's the first thing we did. What does Russia do to retaliate, in part, especially once they start seeing that we're surging weapons in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are holding out? What do? They shut off all that piped gas to Europe, starting in May with Bulgaria and Poland shut off. And then one by one, they start shutting off the piped gas to Europe, which again doesn't have anything in reserve. And so suddenly, the other kind of gas you can get, if it's not pipe gas, it's liquefied natural gas, and that's where a lot of the US supply is going out, and it's being liquefied right at these facilities, mostly in the Gulf, and then it goes on to tanker ships, and it goes off to other countries, and then it's regasified, and then goes into systems, and it runs, heats people's homes, and it runs factories, and all kinds of other kind of stuff. But the Europeans they have again, critically low levels of pipe gas. They can't get any more pipe gas from Russia in their repositories, so we have to then figure out ways to get more of liquefied natural gas coming from us, from Qatar, from other countries that are in that business to Europe, so they do not freeze to death. And the prices go crazy in the summer of 2022, and people are panicking. And we're using all these institutions, the G7, the G20, the International Energy Agency, to come up with different ways we can immediately get them to reduce their consumption, which is really good, helps, and also start to do all the things that we were doing with our domestic bills. So I'll try to electrify everything as quickly as possible. Move away from gas heating units to heat pumps and on and on and on, and are succeeding in kind of that stuff. So we're able to, because again, why does Russia do this? Not just to punish the Europeans, because they want to decrease support for the war, right? That's what they're trying to do, break apart the coalition, which is still holding steady. And then the last thing, you mentioned it. So we get through that phase. Then winter is coming. Winter is coming. We think Europe's going to be okay. We don't think they're going to have to go into some kind of austerity measures and shut down factories or run them half-time or something like that, and which would create an economic problem that would reverberate back to the United States for sure, is Russia starts terror bombing the Ukrainian electricity grid. And this is horrific. And I just want all of you to understand this part of the war. It's not just two armies fighting each other, right? When Russia they start bombing the electricity grid, not the sources of electricity. They're not bombing coal-fired power stations. They're not bombing hydroelectric dams, right? They're not bombing nuclear power plants, thankfully. They did take over one big one, but that's something else. And why did they not do that? Because there aren't that many of them. And you can protect all of them. You can put anti-aircraft batteries around them, right? You can you can shoot down the missiles and the drones coming at them. But an electricity grid has 10 to 100, if you look at it, times more targets in it as you distribute electricity throughout a grid. And what happens when your grid goes down? You can't just shut off these power plants. They don't work that way. They're too big, and they could be dangerous, right? Depending on the kind of energy you're talking about. Because if you do that, so what do you have to do in order, because the electricity is still coming now, you can turn it down a little bit, the electricity is still coming out, but it's going into an increasingly dysfunctional grid. And what do the Ukrainians have to do? They have to intentionally cause massive blackouts. And the Russians knew this was going to happen. They planned this. And what happens when you do massive blackouts? Well, your cities become almost unlivable because you start losing sewage systems. You lose the ability to pump water. You lose emergency services. It all goes down. And this is what what are the Russians doing by attacking the electricity grid? They're creating, right, a massive, massive war refugee problem. And a lot of Ukrainians do actually go surge across the border to Poland and other countries, who thankfully took them in. And so this is the reason it's important to say this is because, and this is something I was also not, because I didn't have a skill set to do this, but man, I had an amazing team who stepped up and did this, because this was a direct attack on the civilian population. You're not hurting the Ukrainian army by doing this. You're attacking civilians by bombing the electricity grid. So what do we have to do? We had to go all around the United States and then all over the world finding massive pieces of high voltage electricity equipment to buy, borrow, sometimes donated from US utilities, US companies, and then get it shipped over to Ukraine. For this bizarre reason, my office, which was much smaller than the State Department and much smaller than, bless it, no longer there anymore, but USAID, which normally they have billions of dollars. I had tens of millions that I got from the first Ukrainian supplemental that was money that I could redirect to this effort. And so the first emergency high voltage electricity equipment, I'm not talking like extension cords, right? I'm talking about massive things that you have to palletize and send over in these big Air Force planes. We get them over there. The first 900 pieces come from our office.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this question about the relationship between energy and security.
Yeah.
And so in the case of Russia, the weaponization of energy all has to do with fossil fuels.
Yeah, except for attacking the grid.
Except for attacking the grid.
That's right.
Yeah.
But fossils were their first two weapons of choice.
Right.
That's
and
right.
so is there a link, do you think, between our reliance on fossil fuels and this sort of ability to weaponize energy?
Yes, and we've seen this before. Like we've seen this before. If you go, it's the other side of the equation for sure, One of the things that was happening during World War II is the Nazis were running out of oil, and it was really hampering their war effort, thankfully. And so they were starting to look into basically turning coal to gas, which is a very complicated process to go to, but they had coal, right, in the Ruhr Valley and other places, and so they're looking into that as a last-ditch effort. The South Africans actually were looking at the same thing once the big embargoes against apartheid started. They also were advanced there before the transformation of that government. But the oil market is a global market. I've already explained that. And the LNG market became a global market because of the Russian war. It started to operate, right, like the oil market in the sense that no one could really control the price even if you were the supplier of it. And people were quite worried about if we were surging more LNG, right, out there to help the Europeans, what that would mean there would be less gas, piped gas here in the United States, and so what would happen with respect to our prices. So it was a delicate dance on that kind of stuff. But I think basically the ultimate form of energy security is energy independence. This is not an anti-trade claim. I'm not excited about what's been happening with the use of tariffs as a weapon by the current administration in the way that they're doing it. So absolutely in favor of free trade with energy projects as well. But the narrow pipelines, the relatively small number of countries that control fossil energy, given the absolutely dominant place that fossil energy has played in, not just in like keeping the lights on, but think about this, is that fossil energies historically, because remember, when Carter put solar panels on the White House, that was a luxury good, man. That was not cheap. Now solar is cheaper, and it's gone down faster than anyone could have possibly imagined. And that plus other renewables will now outpace coal as the dominant energy source in just a couple of years, according to the International Energy Agency, a report I believe that came out today or yesterday. But energy security is never really going to come when you're beholden on others to provide your fuel stock to you, period, right? It won't come from that. It's got to, the best energy security is energy independence. Now again, this is not a message of sort of being against the suppliers and the companies that provide that, but take a country like India, biggest country in the world in terms of population. It's the country that I know the most about. It's been my geographical focus in addition to my topical focus in climate and clean energy issues. And I love its amazing story, the Indian story about how they've started to move towards renewable energy independence for the most populous country in the world. And when I was first working on India 15, almost 20 years ago, India had one of the world's worst energy poverty problems in the world too. Hundreds of millions of people had no access to electricity. And even now, even though they've achieved universal access to electricity in the first part of the 2020s, which is terrific, it's not like this. It's not like reliable electricity everywhere in the country where you just turn on the lights and it's there, right? So it's still happening. But what's been amazing there has been India, which has coal, doesn't have oil in any great quantities, has refineries, and doesn't have gas. So what's their pathway to energy independence? It's renewable energy. It's clean energy. They've got a lot of access to sun, and they've been able to massively build out, right, their renewables portfolio. So this is also not an advertisement for the Modi administration. I know is controversial for lots of issues, right, in India, but the Modi administration was 1,000% more intent on a positive climate and a positive clean energy agenda than anything we'd ever seen in India before. So when Modi is elected in the spring of 2014, India has around 3 gigawatts of solar, kind of 4 if you kind of squinted and weren't really paying attention whether or not they're really connected yet to a grid. Modi comes in 2014, and the Congress Party, previous to that, had a target of 20 gigawatts of solar capacity by 2022 or 2023. Modi, in like day one or in the first month, says, I want it to be 100 gigawatts. And all of us in India and energy experts kind of went, oh, 100 gigawatts, that's such a nice round number. Like, and they can't possibly do it, right, in less than a decade. How are they possibly going to do this? And they came extremely close. Now, he said, okay, it's not going to be completely 100 gigawatts of solar. We're going to get some wind in there as well and some other kind of renewables. Fine, still, they achieve this. And then he increases it then to 250, right, by the end of the 2020s, and then takes it up to 500 gigawatts of non-fossil energy. So this is super serious about how you do this, and that's the kind of thing. And now India will be better able to withstand these shocks, right, globally that could happen by future geopolitical events that some which we can guess at, but most we can't predict. So it's absolutely clear now to me. And I sort of say that when we started in the Biden administration, we were sort of like, okay, we're going to get the U.S. back in the Paris Agreement. We're going to, we're going to once again become a global leader on climate change. It is a crisis. It is something we absolutely must work on, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. But we've got to have broader messaging, and we've also got to have a better way of doing policies so it doesn't look like just a narrow environmental concern. So we made it a jobs message. This is how we're going to create American jobs. And we did. And I can give you some interesting stats about particular jobs that I created through some energy projects that I led. But then, because of the Ukraine war, our language shifted. We didn't give up on jobs. We didn't give up on climate. Man, we started talking more about energy security. And it wasn't opportunistic. It was because you could see it in front of you every single day, watching the markets go crazy, watching these physical attacks. Any party that wanted to either controls the resources, right, or is willing to actually physically go and do a cyber attack or some other kind of attack on another country that they're connected to, that is a real palpable threat that we've got to be prepared for.
So I wonder what sort of tensions or maybe even symbiosis there is between energy security, energy weaponization, and climate change targets. I mean,
yeah.
Is there, it seems like, it seems like for example, the release of the stored, the oil reserves is antithetical to meeting climate goals. But there are certain ways in which it seems like, if we increase security by no longer relying on fossils, that there might be some connections here between, defending against energy wars. And
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think that, look, no one wants the climate crisis to happen. No one wishes that this was true, that it just turns out to be that we've got a kind of atmospheric chemistry, right, that reacts a certain particular way to the fuel that's basically been driving the engine of prosperity for 150 years. It is a tragic set of combination there, because especially it gets us in this, and also it's not just the atmospheric chemistry, it's also the particularly interesting way and unforgiving way in which carbon dioxide in particular reacts, because it doesn't just, it's not like normal pollution. For one thing, it's not point source pollution. It's not like you dump something into the Anacostia, right, and it pollutes locally first, and then yes, it can go downstream, but it dilutes as it goes down further downstream. Sometimes it gets embedded. It's variable. Carbon dioxide emitted anywhere in the world causes the problem everywhere in the world. You could be the best climate citizen in the world, the lowest emissions. It does not matter. As long as around the top 20 or so emitters, who are responsible for around 70% of global emissions, if those 20 countries, right, don't have ambitious climate targets, forget it. You're going to suffer no matter how good a climate actor as a country that you are, no matter how good a climate citizen you are, no matter whether you drove an EV here, as I did, or have solar panels in your house or what have you. So it's pernicious in that way. And it's not only that it's not point source, it is long-lived. So the emissions that go up into the atmosphere depending on where they go and the way that and different other factors, are going to continue to be forcing the temperature for hundreds to thousands of years. So we could magically turn off all the CO2 going into the atmosphere today, anthropogenic CO2, like caused by us. You still got global warming because of the historical emissions, the emissions that have already gone up there. It's different with methane, different with hydrofluorocarbons, other greenhouse gases. Happy to talk about that if you'd like. This really difficult thing is like, because what we can't afford, unfortunately, is for, if you look at the top 20 countries in the world, most of them are developed countries, not developing countries, if you count the EU as like one party. So we need a model for development. We need a model for sustainable development. This is the watchword we use, but I'm going to change that in a minute. We need a model for development which creates not only more prosperity, but people live longer, they live healthier, right? They once they sort of, as their economies get better and grow. I'm not talking about grotesque luxury emissions or something like that, but just sort of like just livable, so that people can have decent lives. You need something to power that transition. And because most of us live in democracies, you can't just constantly have people live in austerity measures, right? You've got to let people move from, barely making a living, barely being able to feed their kids, to being able to feed their kids regularly, to having access to electricity, which means growth. So you don't just need sustainable development, you need sustainable growth. And that has to come, right, from non-fossil emitting sources. They could be fossil fuels that are then abated with some sort of technology that captures the emissions and stores it underground. Obviously, it can come from nuclear energy as well, which has been historically the biggest source of non-fossil energy outside of hydro. And then all the collection of, we have them right now, or kind of over the horizon, pretty close to horizon energy technologies, plus, importantly, if you're going to be doing solar and wind, storage, battery storage, long duration battery storage. And so the climate crisis and the peculiar nature of it that I just sort of explained. The pollution here causes the pollution everywhere. It causes the problem everywhere. No one is isolated. No one can be safe from that. And also the long-lived nature of it means, number one, we absolutely have to cooperate, right? And number two, the good part about that is it will drive us towards actually a more secure energy world. And I don't have a doubt that global energy transition is going to happen. It is still happening, and I do not believe this administration can stop it from happening globally. That's good. It's not happening fast enough, and that's bad. And that's where the next few years are going to be absolutely critical on that, which is now not just a climate story, but as you said, Blake, an energy security story.
Right. I think it's time to turn it over to audience questions. Does that work for you?
Oh, yeah, great, okay. So the first question I have asks, does intelligence tell us that an attack on our own power grid is likely or inevitable? Are you nervous? And do you personally have any adaptations or preparations you have made in anticipation of something like that?
It's good. It's a great question. There have been attacks on the U.S. electricity grid and the gas and gas pipelines. There was something called a Colonial Pipeline, which happened I believe, in 2021, in the first year of the Biden-Harris administration, which was a cyber attack on a major gas pipeline, I think coming up into the, up the East Coast. And we don't have any idea who did that, whether it was a state actor or, a kind of people messing around, we don't know who the actors were there. And there have also been attacks on the U.S. electricity grid. We've done a very good job at hardening our grid and emergency preparation. And it was interesting, there's an office, and this is something you should never do. I'm gonna say an acronym without being able to remember what the acronym is, right? But there's an office in the Department of Energy called CSER, which is an incredibly important office, which is the office that actually deals with emergency response measures, especially where there are natural disasters, right? and how that affects the electricity or other parts of the energy infrastructure in the United States, or deals with cyber attacks and stuff like that. And they've done an amazingly good job of helping to prep companies to do this, and how to harden their infrastructure, to be able to find malware, to be able to sort of stop things like this. I do not anticipate that anyone's going to be bombing the US grid, which is good, but I do think that we have to watch out for cyber attacks. And the important thing about that is that, more importantly, we've got to help other countries to prepare for that. And so one of the things that the Trump administration created, give them full credit for this, and Trump won, they created something called the Partnership for Transatlantic Energy Cooperation. And it's basically a Eastern Central European collection of countries, around 35 of them, and the United States. And every year, there's a ministerial summit, so the Secretary of Energy and ministers of energy from Eastern and Central Europe put on a big meeting somewhere in Eastern Europe and deal with a bunch of things like advancing renewable energy. We added a track on geothermal, nuclear. A lot of countries use nuclear in that part of the world, as do we, and promote it, and so working together on nuclear cooperation. But one of the most important things we did is cybersecurity training for countries there. Why? Because Russia is right there. And remember Ukraine. I said Ukraine was connected to the Russian grid until days before the war started. Up until January, this past January or February, all 3 Baltic countries, remember, which were part of the Soviet Union, were still connected to the Russian electricity grid. It's called the Brel system, B-R-E-L-L. So it's this circular loop that went from Russia, Belarus, and then Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Kaliningrad, which is like that little piece of Russia that's kind of sticks out like into the west, and connected there. They were still connected. And we had done everything we could to create cyber training for those 3 Baltic countries, because they're certainly worried that if Russia were to completely take Ukraine, then they would be next. And we have seen some drone flyovers and things already in that part of the world. But fundamentally what we had to do was get them independent from the Russian grid. And I worked on that every single day. The Trump administration started that program in Trump 1. We expanded it and did not hesitate, because obviously once the war started, it was so critically important to have that cooperative platform. And thankfully the Trump administration has continued it, so I hope that they'll still be in that business.
Okay, thank you. So there are a number of questions about China, so let me just give you one from an audience member. So can you say a little bit about the global competition between China and the US re-energy technology and energy exports and its political implications?
Yes, that's a big question. And it's a great question. So there are problems with the clean energy transition, though. So first of all, let me tell you about one thing, just in prep for this, because it has to do with a lot with China. So 2 big important facts you need to know, and this is why I'm confident this administration cannot stop the global clean energy transition. Number 1 is that last year, in 2024, for the first time in history, 40% of all electricity in the world was produced by non-fossil sources, by clean energy sources, including nuclear. So we're already we're moving way faster than any energy analyst would have said a decade ago. Number 2, the last year, the trade in clean energy approached $1 trillion. 10 years ago, it was 185 billion. There are precious few markets of any kind that have seen a jump that massive in 1 decade, because people do get it for climate reasons, for job growth reasons, for energy security reasons. That is where they're going, that's where they're building, and it's cheap. And so like when we originally created the big framework convention on climate change, the thing where there's a big UN summit on climate change every year, this is what we created the Paris Agreement through. When we did that in 1992, and we were saying to developing countries, we got to find an alternative pathway to growth. It's like sort of, that's going to cost a lot, because man, solar was not cheap then. Even that wasn't even the 70s. That was the early 90s. Now it's again the cheapest form of energy on the planet. You add battery storage to that, and you're off and moving, and that's how we're seeing this. I spent a couple days talking to bankers of almost every stripe on Wall Street this past summer, and was finding that still, people are looking for what are the energy investments they can still make in the United States versus the world. Now, $1 trillion, 40% of electricity, what is the single biggest factor in the world that made that happen? China. Because China is producing those ridiculously cheap solar panels and components and modules and cells and everything going out there and so many other things. And China controls, and more importantly, refines most of the critical mineral supplies in the world. Graphite and on and on and on. All these different critical minerals and materials that not only go into your cell phone and to satellites and stuff like that, but also into clean energy markets as well. So China's been enormously successful, far more successful than any other country. With the Inflation Reduction Act, we're trying to reshore as much as we possibly could to build a future where the US could, in some ways, compete a little bit with China on that. That's taken away now. So I would sort of say that where we were in the Biden administration was trying to stand up to China on some of these issues, because partly one of the reasons why that China has produced as much as they have, some people don't like this term, I think there's truth to it, is because they don't only have a regular supply of all the solar stuff, they have an oversupply of it. So it's being sent out in the world at these even cheaper than the market would normally price them, which is very, very, very low, which is very good, but not if you're, say, a government somewhere in the world trying to build an at-home solar industry. So then you start seeing that's where we were using tariffs and all kinds of things to try to restrict that in the Inflation Reduction Act to try to give some breathing space. Now, regardless of where that went, now with a lot of those components, so we were in a kind of a difficult position. We were diplomatically also at odds with a bunch of other things as well, Taiwan, kind of other security issues. Towards the end of the administration, we started to talk clean energy cooperation again. We were just getting really some serious, interesting conversations, ways that we could help them improve, ways that they would sort of help us think through a better way to think about the global marketplace and what would be the best conditions for a global transition, a stable global transition in clean energy. And then it was over. And now, obviously, it's stalled completely. And I was in Beijing in June, and the Chinese are not really sure what's going to come next on that kind of stuff. So we're at an impasse, but I'd sort of say this in terms of what I'd say now is that if you look at the July 4th, one big beautiful bill, right, that did take away parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, and especially, it kept some things. Geothermal's okay, biofuels are okay, you still get the tax credits for those. You can still get tax credits for sequestering carbon. In fact, it's a little bit better. Nuclear credits are good. Support for the nuclear industry is good. What is this administration really going after? EVs? If you're planning on, buying an EV with the former U.S. tax credit, of course, that's gone. I think it was about a week ago was the last week you could actually get access to that tax credit. What else has this administration gone after? Solar and wind. Now, in a major, major way. Solar, I can give some kind of explanation from when I'm going to come back to China. Wind, I don't understand it. And it's been extreme, the attacks on wind in the United States. But they've gone after solar and wind in a major way. Those credits are gone. There's some extension for some projects if you built a certain amount by January 1st and broken ground on them. But it'll be gone pretty soon. And we had done all these things in the Biden administration to try to push China back and still build all of our renewable energy capacity in the United States, and then also help US firms get contracts in other parts of the world. Now with the United States not doing that kind of stuff anymore, what's going to happen? Whatever happens in the next 4 years, when this administration is done, and I'm not making a prediction about the next election, the global energy markets will once again mostly belong to China. And China, you will see, it's incredibly. When I went to Beijing in June, I had not been there since before COVID. Half of all cars in China are EVs. It's astonishing. And you can see it because they all have green license plates. So you can sort of tell what's. Beautiful cars, EVs that I've never heard of before. Build Your Dreams was just one of them, and the many models they have, but others. And they're cheap. And because the US, I think partly in response to the tariffs that the United States is putting on other countries, you're seeing Europeans and Chinese and others make peace about Chinese exports, whether it's solar stuff or EVs or what have you. And that will be what the market looks like. And it will be really difficult for any US companies to get into those markets because of that.
So we've had a number of questions about the effect of big data centers for AI training and how you see that, how it's affecting things now and how you see that impacting things in the future.
So there's a couple of things on that. And one question is like, how much is the need for data centers really going to, what will really be the data demands on AI? And at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, there's a team run there by a guy named David Sandalow, who had my last job, Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at DOE. He had it in the first half of the Obama administration. And David produces a series of reports. I think it's just launching a new one on this. I think it's a great source. So just go look for Sandalow, Columbia, Artificial Intelligence Energy, and you'll get this big conference report on this. There's some good news on that I won't go into now, but there is a lot of ways in which AI will lead to more efficiencies in energy systems. And one of the problems you have, we do know how to solve this problem, though I assure you, even though people who don't like clean energy will always say, oh, we don't want solar and wind and stuff because it's variable, right? So because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and like, heard that phrase so many times now, it's like, it's a little irritating. So yeah, I know, okay, get it. Like, sun doesn't always shine. Yes, I get it. The earth rotates. I learned that in grade school. You know, sometimes it's dark, and I've experienced it in my life every day, I think. But we have solutions to that. They're called batteries, right? And so, and we're getting better and better and better at batteries, and for long duration storage. But it's complicated to manage a grid because you've got some power plants like nuclear power plants and coal plants and gas plants which are running all the time essentially as long as you want to run them, and then other stuff that's coming in more variable. And so you have to integrate that, and you have to balance, right, the electricity load, and that can be tricky. It can be done though, but this is why there's often like a gap between what's called installed capacity so how much of an energy-making plant do you have that has, and how many gigawatts can it produce, right? And then there's another figure which is the actual gigawatts that it produces. And those can be variable for a fossil energy plant too, but they can be really variable, right? Depending on the climatic conditions and other kinds of things like that when it comes to solar and wind. And so you have to sort of figure out how do you balance loads. And there's lots of interesting works on this, and our national labs are brilliant at it. And we would send these people out in like giant teams to help people to figure this out. It's one of the reasons that actually China still claims they need to have a lot more coal, and they are building more coal, though they tell us, don't worry, we won't run those plants at full time. And then I kind of go, why would I not worry about that? That just, like, why do you have to do this? And then they'll say energy security, and you're going to go, oh, that's not really, but you've got all this solar, and they'll go, yeah. But they have one of the biggest gaps in the world between their installed capacity and what they actually produce, and partly because they don't manage their grid well enough. Well, AI will help them with that, so that's good. On the bad stuff, it's just like these things suck a lot of power. There are some debates about those figures, but I just heard it, and it's also totally irresponsible. This is like the acronym thing. I'm going to give you an acronym. I don't know what it stands for. I heard something on the radio driving up here. It's one of the big AI companies. Maybe it's OpenAI. Their electricity, they paid $1 trillion in electricity, and it's over, I can't remember the increment. It wasn't a year, but it was like a new sort of figure that we got. It's like, this is a massive amount, especially when you're doing training of modules and stuff like this. And obviously, these are transforming part of America. Northern Virginia, where my university is, George Mason, right, is just like the home of these massive amounts of these data centers. Huge. I think it's maybe the biggest, one of the 2 or 3 biggest centers in the world. Now, here's the good news on this. Even though this administration, the current administration, is dismantling tax credits for solar and wind, which is, again, is fast and cheap. All of these major providers, Amazon, Google, Zuckerberg's thing, it's not Facebook, it's Meta, right? All these guys, they've all, us and climate, advocates like me, whether in government, out of government, persuaded them all to sign all these clean energy pledges for their systems, and they're still doing it. And so it's weird, right? But it's sort of like this thing that, and this was like the summer of AI. Blake's met my son, Milos, or one of my sons, Milos, who's really quite, he's 16, he's politically quite astute, deep reader, deep thinker already, and he gets all this, honestly, I didn't force him on it, I swear to God. But he, so this was like the summer, his brain was really concerned about AI all summer. We talked about AI the entire summer, and there's a lot to be concerned about AI. But weirdly enough, so the US electricity consumption has been relatively flat for like 15 years, and now it's all going up, and it's driven by data centers. And that still is going to keep alive like solar plants and other solar providers and others in the United States, because it's the waiting time to get a gas turbine. If you want to, you've got a lot of cheap natural gas in the United States. If you want to build a new gas plant to power a data center, because of these supply chain problems we have that go back to COVID, it's like 7 to 10 years before you can get a turbine. So if you want to build a data center in Northern Virginia, Loudoun County, something like that, if you want to do it on schedule, it's basically batteries and storage. You can talk about small modular reactors or fusion, or, maybe someday, things like that. But that's a long, long lead time for that. So if you need that power now, you need it. And because they will pay the premium, thankfully, still, to keep those pledges, then the providers of that material will still be able to stay in business. So that's good news.
There's still, people have a lot of worries about the effects of these data centers on, say, like local data or local energy availability or local energy prices.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's still
a problem, which is why which is what's going to drive those providers, because they can't get around that problem. They just can't steal all the power right away from people. The energy. Not only do the energy markets not work that way, but the regulators, will not allow that to happen. And so they're going to have to build more, and it's going to have to come from renewable energy. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so changing directions for a moment, an audience member asks, has working at the highest level of politics changed your view on the possibility of persuading an opponent through rational argumentation?
That's a brilliant question. Has it changed my view? I thought it was really hard before I was in government. I think it's really hard after I've been in government. So I guess I definitely, I guess I was, for someone with a PhD in philosophy, I was never persuaded by the idea that the smartest, the best argument is the one that prevails. I just don't think that happens in life, like when you're talking to the person you live with, right? Or your children, if you have them, or, I think we can have a reason to believe it's the best argument, absolutely, but it often doesn't prevail for lots of reasons, right? Which are very interesting. I guess what I am more persuaded now that I've done, it's one thing to talk about this theoretically, but then it's quite another thing, and we do it every day. We have to sort of try to make a case to someone about, but I think we should do X rather than Y, or we can do Y, but let's do a little less of Y than maybe what you were thinking, and here's why, something like that. What really the most interesting thing that I got to do on a day-to-day basis was multilateral negotiations. And that is where it's kind of interesting there. What I found is, maybe the way I'll answer this question is this, is what I've come to appreciate is that people really like it when you explain your position to them. And they often can be more open to changing their mind if you actually take the time to do it. And maybe this is why background in philosophy, one of the reasons background in philosophy actually helps me in a job like this. So especially like the G20 is a really difficult forum. And there's the G20 Leaders Summit that if you pay attention to the G20, this is the 20 largest economies in the world, right? And they have a summit every year. The United States is not participating in this year's summit. South Africa has the presidency. It's a tragedy that they're not doing that because the South Africans really had some good ideas. But in addition to the leaders meeting and the leader declaration, there's tracks. There's a foreign minister's track. There's a track on the environment. There's a track on trade. And there's an energy track, right? It's called the Energy Transitions Working Group. And so I was the lead negotiator for the United States in all of those energy forums, and with a really great team, amazingly talented team that sort of worked with me on that. And when you're doing a multilateral negotiation like that, it operates by consensus. You don't close the text. You don't get a statement unless everyone agrees. And that's kind of like not the hardest one. The Framework Convention on Climate Change is 195 countries. So to get the Paris Agreement, we had to get 195 countries to agree on the same thing. But the G20 is just 20, but 20 countries that don't generally back down, right? You can think of this. And think about the time that I'm in the room. China's in the room, and we were not doing well with China during most of that time. Russia's in the room, and we're now like on the other opposite sides of a war with them, not just an energy war, but a shooting war. My favorite allies, India, are there too, and I have a great relationship with them, but they're tough. They're really incredibly tough, right, on things where they have particular views. The Saudis, right, which obviously we had our differences of opinions, even though we managed to do a lot of really great cooperative work with them. And so you've got like a text you're working on for the Energy Transitions Working Group meetings. You could look them up. The ministerial statements would run 20 to 40 plus pages. And every single word has to be agreed upon. So you've got it like up, a PowerPoint thing is like, you've got the text, or you're projecting a screen, someone's computer screen onto a big screen, and you're basically just going line by line. Like every country gets to sort of put up their flag and say, cut this word, change it to that, cut this sentence, add that paragraph, da-da-da, and you're doing this for a year to do this. And a lot of people just would never explain their positions. They would just like cut text, and then people would go, and then people would put up their flags and kind of go, okay, France agrees with, paragraph 3, line 27, da-da-da, and then just like, and you go like that and you do several all-nighters while you're trying to sort of negotiate this stuff through the course of a year. And I always thought I should explain the position that I was taking, right? Because most people just don't. They just make the change. And so what I found was that actually I have more faith that people can be persuaded now to come to a compromise at least when you take the time to just try to explain why you think something is important and not just like use the cudgel of essentially what every country in the room has in a situation like that, which is a veto, right? And I would say the United States will veto this, but here's why. And here's why we want to add something. And then obviously find my allies. And I should sort of say, with all the problems that we have with China, I'm most proud this was, what I really liked about my last job was actually getting to open up the doors to build real stuff in the world, clean energy projects. But also some of the negotiating things that I really liked the most was that US and China wouldn't agree on many, many things in that process for 4 years. But at the very end, I'd tried so hard to get closer to them, is that we were able to come up with a US-China proposal for a new global target on clean energy storage. Because again, solar wind isn't nearly as powerful, right, unless you've got batteries. So we said we're really going to take it up to a big 6-7-fold increase in global battery storage by 2030. And people were shocked because there was this piece of paper that said US-China proposal, right? And people were going, what, this can't be real, right? But it was partly because we took the time to talk to each other. Yeah.
So we've gotten questions that are sort of two sides of the same thing. Is access to energy a human right, in your view? And the complement to that is an attack on an energy grid ever justified? I think that's somewhat related.
Well,
Yeah.
so I guess, do I think access to energy is a human right? I guess I would sort of say that of all the human rights you can think of, I think access to energy is a prerequisite for just about all of them, for most of them, right? Exercise of that. Because one of the iron laws of development is that you can't be in a, you can't get out of a state of poverty if you're in a state of energy poverty. With the one exception, if you live in an intentional community, right, that is designed to mutually support people living completely without access to anything other than human energy, right? Physical labor, essentially, and some slightly augmented physical labor. So if you're in a state of energy poverty, you can't get out of poverty. And this has been proven time and time and again. And we know of the devastating impacts that like this has on people's lives if you can't do it. And so it's why, originally when we were negotiating the Framework Convention on Climate Change, this is before I got into any of this, in '92, we said, okay, because that long lifetime of CO2 and the first countries to develop were the ones that use fossil fuels to develop, and so we said there's a differentiation between the obligations of developed and developing countries to deal with climate change. And it's this phrase in the Framework Convention on Climate Change called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So everyone has a responsibility to do something on climate change because we're all polluters. But though these are common, they are differentiated. And they're differentiated, and this is where the text is silent, but differentiated based on what? How long you've been an emitter and what your development needs are. And in 1992, you needed fossil energy to develop. You don't now. You might need a lot of help, right, to get access to loans and capital and all that kind of stuff so that more of that trillion floating around the world looking for clean energy projects can get there. But you do have, richer countries need to contribute to helping to enable those kinds of transitions. And so that's kind of point one. And I think on the other point, I would sort of say that, look, it should, insofar as an attack on an electricity grid is an attack on a civilian population, and I really do believe that. It's not how you attack an army. There could be some exceptions to this, to attacking parts of a grid that are connected to certain military assets. So I can imagine that as being part of a war strategy, and I do think that there are just wars, and so I do believe that, you can imagine that. But I think that when it comes to a mass grid like that, the situation would have to be incredibly dire to justify directly attacking a civilian population in that way, indiscriminately in that way, the way that Russia did on Ukraine.
So there are a couple of comments about nuclear energy. So an audience member asks, you've made a few references to nuclear energy in a very positive fashion. I think nuclear is quite more controversial in America than you've let on. Can you make an ethical case for nuclear energy?
The most ethical case you can make for nuclear energy is that because of the climate crisis, we cannot leave any solution off the table, period. Were it not for the climate crisis, absolutely, we'd be in a better position to look at some of these other ancillary ways in which we'd compare like one non-emitting energy source from another. But I just think we can't afford to. Up until recently, like most non-fossil energy in the United States was nuclear, even though we haven't built a new nuclear, we've built one new nuclear power plant, the Vogtle plant in Georgia. The Westinghouse AP1000's there, but we hadn't built one for, decades before that. And I don't know how many more of those are going to get built in the US because they're so expensive. They will get built in other parts of the world, and I think in some parts of the world it is a far better solution. especially in those countries, and I saw this in Eastern and Central Europe, which historically have used nuclear energy, have a workforce who understands the technology and can work in these plants. And then the question is, can you get them into better, safer designs of plants? At some point, it's been the kind of a never-ending story in the nuclear. Are there people that are going to push back in the United States if we started building a lot more nuclear in the United States, especially this new generation of what are called small modular reactors? Absolutely sure, they would be. And we have to deal with that in the best ways in which our democratic institutions hopefully are still strong enough to negotiate whether or not those plants will go forward under what conditions. But I do think that that it is not just for producing electricity, but especially when we get to what we call the hard-to-abate sectors, which we have to decarbonize as well. Steel production, chemical manufacturing, big industrial processes like this. Those are things in which you need some kind of base load power that's going to do that. I think geothermal is a really, really good option too. And we've got a lot of great we can use a lot of fracking technology to do geothermal in places we never thought we could do that. And maybe that will outpace nuclear and be more acceptable to more people in the world or in the United States. But in the meantime, I think that's still a solution we absolutely have to invest in.
So I'm going to take my moderator's privilege to ask the final question of the night. And it's sort of come up here and there, especially in your answer to the excellent question about rational discussion. But we have a lot of philosophy students in the audience, and a lot of our philosophy students are interested in like broad topics and the applications of philosophy across broad topics. And I guess I kind of want to ask you, maybe I'll put it this way. What advice do you have for students who are interested in like taking their philosophy degree out into the world and making a difference in the areas that they're interested in?
I think, so a couple things on this. First of all, I think when people ask me, like, what in your philosophical training has prepared you for, has been of most of value in the kind of doing climate energy advocacy work or working in a government. And I think that the thing that philosophy is a variegated discipline, right? There are people, so many different kinds of philosophers, so many different traditions in philosophy. I would argue that the one thing that all traditions have in common is being able to distinguish a good reason from a bad reason, being able to distinguish a good argument from a bad argument. And what especially, it's less so when I've been at think tanks and NGOs, but when you're in government, especially as you sort of get up, into these, and you're not only managing a big team, but also having to brief a secretary, right? Brief a cabinet official on a regular basis. So much gets thrown. I gave you a big example of Ukraine, right? Being thrown at me and how my job changed. I had one job I thought I had, then I had a whole other job, and so many of my team members did as well. But we all supported and worked well together. But you've got to be able to absorb a ton of information very quickly and then figure out what's a better reason from a worse reason. And if you can't figure it out, who can help you? Who can tell? And how can you understand the answers that they're giving you? And I think that basic understanding of reasoning and argumentation serves us extremely well. Washington is chock-a-block with non-practicing lawyers, right? People who went to law school, they've never practiced law a day in their life, but they work in all these policy institutions. And they're very specialized, like I've been, like, healthcare, they're healthcare experts, or they're tax policy experts, or what have you. What is it that law school, what is it about, well, I think, law degrees sort of become an imprimatur degree that sort of helps as a calling card for applying for those kinds of jobs. But you're not getting hired, many of these people, to do law, to anything like understand the Constitution or, precedents for a Constitution. They're not practicing as lawyers. What do they know how to do? They know how to reason, right? And that's you learned a certain kind of reasoning in law school, which is common. I think you learn that in philosophy as well. And if you go into graduate school in philosophy, you learn, frankly, I think more of it than you learn in law school. And so there's lots of ways in which people with philosophical training who also have developed a deep understanding in some area of public life, that's a really broad category, then that's a powerful combination if you can do it. I would even, the biggest break that I ever got in terms of getting, to sit here with you and have this conversation is that as a fluke, I got a 3-year postdoc coming out of graduate school when I did my PhD, which was not in philosophy. It was at the University of Alberta in Canada, and it was on energy issues. It was in a program in environmental risk assessment. And 3 years, and that was where I began to be educated, first on the environment, then on energy, then on climate, right, and then coming back full circle. And it was sort of to answer your question, if you continue on through post bachelor's work in philosophy, can you do this kind of work? Yes, but you have to be committed to knowing, again, some area of public life and taking every opportunity you get to do that. And I was lucky enough to get that. I believe in happy accidents. And so I had that happy accident working on what are called the oil sands in Alberta, which is a tough topic, a very tough topic when it comes to energy and environmental damage and all that kind of stuff. But that's where I first started thinking about that, how you engage communities to talk about those kinds of issues, and all the things that I still think about every single day.
Awesome. I think that's a great note to leave things on. And we have refreshments out in the lobby area.
Yeah, and let's
Thank our
thank
speaker.
Yes.